Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're going to dive deep into something that's been on my mind a lot lately. How Christian perspectives are being presented in the ever-evolving world of media.
Sounds intriguing.
It is. And to explore this, we're going to be looking at two very different sources. Excerpts from Charisma News and the Church Times podcast.
So, kind of like two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. One offering, well, at least from their tagline, news stories and interviews, well told from a Christian perspective.
That's an interesting angle right off the bat.
It really is. I mean, it makes you think about what that actually means. What does a Christian perspective even add to a news story?
Right. Are we talking about highlighting certain events that might be overlooked elsewhere? Or offering alternative interpretations, maybe even shaping the narrative to align with certain beliefs?
It's definitely not just about the content itself,
Absolutely.
but the lens through which it's being presented.
Precisely. And that raises some interesting questions about how audiences engage with that kind of content, especially those seeking out information that aligns with their faith.
It could definitely foster a sense of community, right? Like a shared understanding.
Absolutely.
But it also makes you think about the potential limitations.
Yeah. If the perspective is solely Christian, are other viewpoints being considered? Are we getting the full picture?
That tension between offering a sense of belonging and potentially limiting exposure to diverse perspectives is fascinating. And then there's the fact that Charisma News is a podcast on the RSS.com platform.
Oh, that's a big deal.
It's not just a small website tucked away, Ryan.
Not at all. Being on RSS.com speaks volumes about their reach and potential influence.
For sure.
And the role of algorithms in amplifying certain content. How does that impact the spread of religious content, especially one that's coming from a very specific perspective?
That's something to think about. It makes you realize how much technology plays a role in shaping our understanding of faith.
Without a doubt.
And how digital spaces are becoming so crucial for religious engagement, especially for younger generations.
Speaking of engaging diverse audiences, the Church Times podcast takes a different approach altogether. They feature a wide range of voices and perspectives within the Church of England.
A stark contrast to Charisma News, for sure.
Absolutely.
They have episodes on everything from prayer and spirituality to mental health and social justice. It's a much broader scope.
Much broader. They even have a book club podcast, which is a really interesting way to connect traditional media with the digital world.
I love that idea. It's not just about consuming information passively, but engaging with it on a deeper level, discussing and debating, forming a community around shared interests.
Exactly. It creates a space for intellectual and spiritual exploration, even if it's happening online. And the books they choose are fascinating, too. It's not just theology or Christian fiction. They recently discussed Samantha Harvey's novel Orbital, which is a work of literary fiction that explores themes of grief, loss, and searching for meaning.
Such a great example of engaging with faith and spirituality through a broader cultural lens. They're not afraid to ask tough questions or explore perspectives that might challenge traditional views.
Not at all.
I'm so curious to know how listeners are responding to this approach. Do they find it enriches their faith, or maybe challenges it in unexpected ways? It really makes you think about the impact these platforms are having on individual belief systems.
It's a fascinating area of study, for sure. But before we get ahead of ourselves, I think we should take a closer look at some specific examples from both podcasts.
I'm all for that.
How are they actually framing their content? What kind of language are they using? And most importantly, what kind of impact might this have on their listeners?
Let's dive in.
Let's kick things off with the Church Times podcast.
Sounds good to me.
Specifically that episode with the Archbishop of York discussing his book on prayer.
Praying by heart. The Lord's Prayer for everyone.
Yeah.
What really struck me was how he talked about the challenges of prayer in today's world.
It's so easy to feel overwhelmed, isn't it? Like finding the time or even the headspace for prayer can be difficult.
Exactly. But instead of, offering those quick fixes or dismissing those struggles, the Archbishop really digs deep.
He does.
Into how prayer can be this source of resilience in a world that often feels chaotic and overwhelming.
I found his connection of prayer with mindfulness really fascinating.
It's like bridging ancient practice with modern well-being.
Exactly.
And that episode on mental health and Christian spirituality, that was a powerful one.
With Isabel Hamley discussing struggling with God, mental health, and Christian spirituality.
Right, struggling with God. I mean, that's a topic that often gets swept under the rug in religious communities.
Absolutely.
What I appreciated most about that episode was the honesty.
Yeah.
And talking about the pain, the doubt, even anger that could be part of someone's faith journey.
It's real, and she acknowledges that.
It makes the conversation so much more authentic, right?
Definitely.
When you can relate to that vulnerability.
What I found especially powerful, was her emphasis on the importance of seeking professional help
Yes.
alongside spiritual guidance. It's not an either situation.
Right. Faith isn't always the answer when it comes to mental health.
It's about recognizing that there are multiple sources of support.
And it's a message that I think is so important
It is.
for people who might be struggling in silence.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned the book club podcast earlier, and I think we need to circle back to that. It's such a clever way to foster engagement.
I love the book club idea.
They're not just reading theological texts, which would be the obvious choice.
Right.
They've discussed some really thought-provoking works, like Samantha Harvey's novel Orbital,
Oh, yes.
which explores those universal themes of grief, loss.
Not exactly light reading.
It's not. But what I found so insightful was how the podcast hosts drew connections between those themes and the broader concepts of grace and redemption, even in the midst of suffering.
And they weren't trying to force a religious interpretation on the book.
No. They just invited listeners to consider how it might resonate with their own experiences. It's more about reflection than instruction.
I like how you put that, reflection over instruction.
Yeah.
Because it really highlights the power of storytelling,
It does.
to connect with us on an emotional level.
Absolutely. And to show that faith isn't confined to these traditional spaces or texts.
Exactly. It can be found in art, in literature, in everyday life. And the Church Times podcast does such a fantastic job of showing that.
They do.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the Church Times podcast.
We have. It's time to turn our attention to Charisma News.
Use stories and interviews well told from a Christian perspective. That's their tagline.
It is, and it makes you think about how they might be framing those stories differently from, say, a secular news outlet.
It probably means they prioritize stories that align with their specific worldview,
Right.
like maybe events related to religious freedom, social justice issues from a faith-based perspective, or even miracles and divine intervention.
It's definitely a possibility, and that kind of selectivity can resonate really strongly with listeners who share those values.
Absolutely.
But you also have to consider the potential for bias.
Of course.
Yeah.
Are they presenting a fully balanced view, or are they choosing stories that just fit a specific narrative?
It's a question worth asking.
So much to think about when it comes to how faith and media intersect.
It really is a fascinating landscape.
We've explored two really different approaches with the Church Times podcast and Charisma News.
Right. You have one embracing this broad spectrum of voices, engaging with contemporary issues, even exploring faith through a more progressive lens.
And then you have the other offering a more, I guess you could say, traditional viewpoint.
Yeah. More focused.
Focusing on news and events that align with a very specific set of values. It's really interesting how both are finding their audience,
It is.
which speaks to the power of these platforms to connect people with content that resonates with them on a deeper level.
Makes you wonder how this landscape will continue to evolve.
I was just thinking that. Will we see even more niche podcasts popping up, catering to even more specific theological perspectives?
Oh, I'm sure we will.
What about the role of AI in all of this? We touched on algorithms earlier, but I can't help but think about the potential for even more personalized religious content.
It's a bit of a double-edged sword, isn't it? On one hand, you have the potential for incredible tailoring of content to individual beliefs and preferences. But then on the other hand, you have the risk of creating these echo chambers where people are only exposed to information that reinforces their existing views.
Exactly. It's almost like, are we shaping the technology or is it shaping us?
Right.
Deep stuff.
Yeah.
But I think it's a question worth asking as we navigate this ever-evolving digital world.
Definitely. I mean, the intersection of faith and technology is only going to get more complex.
Well,
It's something to ponder, and we encourage you to explore these podcasts for yourselves, see what resonates with you, and draw your own conclusions.
there's so much to discover in the world of faith and media, and this is just the beginning of the conversation. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep diving deep.